In this lesson, I want to talk very briefly about the concept of Brexit in relation to the European Union. This is more going to be a lesson talking about specifically Article 50 of the European Union, and it follows on from the previous lesson where we talked about how new members are acquired in the European Union, i.e., the accession process. This is going to be an examination of the process of leaving the European Union. Now, the concept of Brexit and the European Union, it probably merits its own separate series of lessons, and potentially we will be doing that in the future, covering the concept of Brexit and the European Union and the entire legal, political, and historical process that took place. So we're going to be quite brief in our understanding of specifically talking about Brexit itself and focusing a little bit more on the concept of leaving the European Union. So like I said, the previous lesson spoke about the process of member states being able to join the European Union, the accession process, and this lesson is going to talk about the process of leaving the European Union. Now, the reason why this is specifically a lesson that is titled Brexit and the European Union is because so far, at the time of recording on the 13th of November 2023, there has only ever been one member state to leave the European Union. This is, of course, the United Kingdom. And it seems to be the case that, for the most part, the United Kingdom might be the only member state to leave the European Union, given how catastrophically bad it went in both terms of the resultant deal that was had, the general mediocrity of the state of the United Kingdom post Brexit, and also the problem of actually achieving Brexit in the first place, going through three prime ministers to do so. All seems to suggest that leaving the European Union is not something that many member states really feel like they want to do at this stage. There is, of course, a lot of different kind of Brexit-related leaving European Union kind of fervor and rhetoric around some member states. But for the most part, I don't think that there is a significant and substantial movement in any of the other member states to leave the European Union at the time of recording. So, the term Brexit is a term that is coined to describe the British exit from the European Union. I'm pretty sure it was either Channel 4 or I want to say Channel 4 that first came up with the term Brexit, and they probably should have trademarked that because the amount it's become essentially synonymous with the idea of the Great Britain leaving the European Union. And it formally takes place on the 31st of January 2020, despite the fact that the referendum, which was held to essentially decide whether or not the United Kingdom should leave the European Union, was held in June 2016. And so you can probably see from that the kind of process that was had that took 4 years, essentially, to go from the referendum itself, which was of course not legally binding, all the way to the legally binding withdrawal from the European Union on the 31st of January 2020. At this point, the start of 2020, the United Kingdom entered into a single-year transition period. What the transition period essentially was the UK was no longer officially a member of the European Union. That was established, and that was easy to understand. But the UK still remained part of the European Union's economic system, so it still remained part of the single market, and they did so until a formal trade agreement was made that could be a lot more established. And so that's a result of the fact that we have a transition period over the year of 2020. Which, given what happens in 2020 and the creation of and the wave of pandemic that takes place, it was probably a good idea that we remained part of the single market for that year. So while this lesson is going to be brief in terms of the overview of the Brexit process and the process of leaving the European Union, it should be noted that the study of Brexit is a series of lessons in and of itself, like I've mentioned. And I feel like I want to do a series on the study of Brexit, looking at not only the legal implications of leaving the European Union, but also looking at some of the political and sociological implications that were had in terms of leaving the European Union. It's a very fascinating process that took place in 2016. So the withdrawal process wasn't actually present within the various treaties on the European Union until the Treaty of Lisbon. So it was amended, essentially. The Treaty on European Union was amended to include an extra additional provision, this being Article 50. Article 50, which was drafted by Lord Kerr, was the provision which allows for a member state. It was the mechanism which essentially allows for a member state to leave the European Union. While relatively brief, of course, Article 50 has very important implications. I'm just going to read to you Article 50 in its entirety. Article 50, Part 1 says that any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union in accordance with its own constitutional requirements. A member state which decided to withdraw shall notify the European Council of its intention. In the light of the guidelines provided by the European Council, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that state, setting out the arrangements for its withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. That agreement shall be negotiated in accordance with Article 218, Part 3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. It shall be concluded on behalf of the Union by the Council, acting by qualified majority, after obtaining the consent of the European Parliament. So Part 2 of Article 50 essentially talks about the process of negotiation with the member state that is wishing to leave on the idea of a future relationship that the European Union would have with this member state. The idea here is that leaving with some kind of concluding agreement post-Brexit or post-leaving the European Union is a desirable outcome. And for those of you who lived and was politically active through the period of Brexit, through sort of 2017, 18, 19, and 20, you will be familiar with this idea of, and this concept of leaving without a deal, leaving the European Union without having any kind of negotiated agreement with the European Union, any kind of negotiated preferential agreement with the European Union. And this is sometimes known as WTO arrangements, which essentially refers to the idea that rather than having our own separate trade agreement that is defined between the EU and the UK, we would essentially go to the general rules and principles which are established by the World Trade Organization agreements. That is the idea that was had here, and this is what Part 2 essentially tries to combat, to try and actually get some kind of an agreement. Part 3 talks about the process in which leaving actually takes place, and it says that the treaties shall cease to apply to the state in question from the date of entry into force of the withdrawal agreement, or failing that after 2 years of the negotiation referred to in paragraph 2, unless the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, unanimously decides to extend this period. For the purposes of paragraph 2 and 3, the member of the European Council or the council representing the withdrawing member state shall not participate in the discussions of the European Council or council in decisions concerning it. And then finally, if a state which has withdrawn from the Union asks to rejoin, its request will be subject to the procedure referred to in Article 49. So these last 3 provisions are quite interesting. Part 3 is very, very important. Because what Part 3 tells us is, assuming that you can have a negotiated agreement with the European Union as per Article 52, as we see here, Article 50 Part 2, should I say, then at that point, the treaties will no longer apply to that state in question. Failing that option here, you have 2 years essentially to come up with an agreement, at which point the treaties will cease to apply regardless. This is something which is subject to a number of different conditions. So the 2-year limitation, of course, can be extended if you feel and the European Union feels that there could be an agreement reached, and so therefore there is a unanimous decision to extend said agreement. Or you could essentially withdraw your concerns notification to Article 50 and essentially quash the whole thing in and of itself. Part 5 is also quite interesting in the sense that it allows for a mechanism by which the member state which has left the European Union can potentially rejoin the European Union in the future. But the door is open to even the United Kingdom rejoining the European Union in the future. And given the fact that, given the general outlook towards membership towards the European Union, and given the general outlook of non-membership being not particularly very pleasant in terms of the kind of things that were established, it makes sense to suggest that the UK may join or rejoin the European Union in the future. You might think that I'm being generally political in my outlook towards Brexit, but I think it is objectively the case that Brexit was a bad idea and continues to be a bad idea. This isn't even a political opinion anymore. This is just objective reality. Moving on then, let's talk about the transition period. So, the transition period specifies that once the formal withdrawal from the European Union takes place, there remains largely the same regulation for the rest of the year. So nothing really changes in terms of how goods and services are regulated or the free movement of people, etc., for a year during this transition period. The only thing that is different is the fact that you no longer have any kind of political representation in lawmaking within the European Union. Since the UK formally left the Union on the 31st of January 2020, there was a transition period until the 31st of December 2020. The formal post-Brexit EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement was finally signed on the 30th of December 2020, so cutting it fine, and was the formal agreement between the UK, the EU, with, in addition to this, the European Energy Community as well, Atomic Energy Community. Now, it is a particularly huge agreement. I had to, as a little side note, earlier on this year, I had to do some research work at the university I work at, and one of the things involved me going through and reading the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which was a arduous and slow 2,000-page read, and not something I would recommend people do in their spare time. But for now, let's just leave this idea of Brexit on the table, and we'll start to talk about some of the more structural components of the European Union in future lessons' time, focusing on ideas like EU institutions, lawmaking, and the process of legislation within the European Union.